One of the most brutal realities of the height pill is realizing that as short men, we are desirable, just not necessarily to the people we want. And the reasons men desire us only confirm why women don't. What do I mean by this? Well, if you read the title, you can probably guess, but there's a lot more to it than you might think. I'll start by sharing a few quick stories of some deeply humiliating experiences that both scarred me and left me feeling insecure and confused. We'll start chronologically. So, when I was 14, I had an encounter with a much larger male student that I'll never forget. Back in the first week of freshman year, I was hanging out with some other kids in the crowded quad, still trying to find the right friend group. I dropped a pencil or something and bent down to pick it up, and suddenly, I shit you not, what felt like a cucumber poked my ass. Through my pants, of course. I turned around and looked up to see this towering black guy. He was a senior and a football player, looking down at me with this sick, satisfied smirk. This is the same guy who would cut in line for food and push people, especially me, out of the way. He was wearing basketball shorts, and I'm fairly certain I saw the shape of something long and phallic through the fabric. I wasn't sure if it was his actual wood that touched me or if he was holding something shaped similarly, but I just didn't say anything. I assumed that it was just an object and turned around to continue the conversation with my friends and pretend it never happened. The whole experience barely fazed me at the time, but little did I know, this kind of experience would become somewhat of a pattern in my life. If you guys have ever listened to DBDR, he told a similar story from when he was a kid, only his was much worse. He also seems to only attract gay men. And he made a great point about how when he was assaulted by a gay family friend who was a couple years older than him, it was during a time in his life when he was very small and vulnerable. As we get further along in the video, it's going to become increasingly clear that while women see men that are small and vulnerable as revolting, those same features can be incredibly attractive to other men. Depending on your own preferences, this can be either a blessing or a curse. In my case, it slowly infiltrated my personality over many years, twisting my mind in this attempt to process and adapt to these experiences. As I aged through high school, I failed to grow even 1 centimeter. Having stopped growing when I was 12, I did everything I could to compensate. I may not have realized it, but the experience that I had had when I was 14, along with the years of being targeted by bullies and rejected by women, had left a deep mark in my hetero brain. I wanted to be dominant. I wanted to be big and strong and manly. But being dominated and humiliated by larger men who were desired by women made me feel like I didn't fit in with the dimorphic expression of masculinity that is height and V-shaped frame. By senior year, I had been regularly gym maxing for about 2 years and had begun wearing tight jeans, muscle shirts, tank tops, and lifted combat boots. I also adopted this macho alpha persona that I knew deep down wasn't natural for me, and I think someone picked up on that because I attracted this bully that year who constantly made me feel inferior. This tall, rich kid on the football team. He had broad shoulders, and even in my boots, he was still at least 8 inches taller than me. The only thing I had on him were thicker, more defined muscles and a more attractive face. I would always catch him staring at me, whether from across the courtyard or across the classroom. When I locked eyes with him, he would give me the same kind of sadistic smirk as that black guy from the freshman story. In class, he would throw things at me, his jock friends would laugh, and I would feel humiliated. I threw him back at him and told him to stop fucking throwing shit at me, but he still kept it up. I wanted to push him over in his desk. I can't help but feel like he could tell that I didn't want to fight him because at that time in my life, the most degrading thing I could imagine would be to be beaten in a fight by a tall guy. It's possible I could have won that fight, but I didn't believe in myself at all. He could see through the front I put on, and looking back, I think he got off on the idea of dominating the manlet with short man syndrome. I'm surprised they never actually called me that. They probably knew I would have snapped. And that guy probably was worried about the same thing I was, getting his ass kicked. It's not necessarily the pain that hurts most, it's the humiliation. The weirdest thing was, he would wave at me every time he saw me, even if he was like 100 feet away. I could never quite figure out what his deal was until I looked back on it a couple years later and realized that he probably had some kind of gay crush on me. He tried to take me down a notch, but never quite went all the way. I can't help but imagine that if I hadn't been more muscular than any of those guys on that football team, it could have been a lot worse. That's another thing. I think they were mad that I didn't join the football team because I really would have been the fittest out of all of them. And if I were on the team, he'd have a lot easier time getting his hands on me in the locker room. At that time in my life, any tall guy who tried anything like that with me would feel the full force of my rage. However, this would eventually change. And that brings us to my first year after graduation. One of the things that shaped my perspective growing up was the fact that one of my closest friends was over a foot taller than me. Like, the top of my head was just slightly above his armpit. Everywhere we went, I compared myself to him. It made me invisible to girls, made him look more impressive, and made other people think I was his son or something. Again, the only thing I had over him was a more attractive face. As we got older, his height and shoulders grew while I stayed stuck in my 7th grade body, and it made me feel more and more inferior. So by the time we were both 18, my tallest friend and I both had gotten really into drinking. I would drink to block out the dark thoughts, and he would drink just to have fun. But when he drank, he became weird. He would touch me a lot, try to do push-ups in front of me, take his shirt off and flex, and overall just violate my personal space. I would get extremely annoyed because all that he was doing was making me feel even more emasculated, knowing that even though I was muscular and spent more time working out, he was probably still more powerful than I was, and rubbing it in my face. But sometimes he would take things way too far by trying to pick me up and carry me around. My other 5'9" friend didn't seem to mind letting him give him piggyback rides, but I was very uptight about it. The last thing I wanted was to be seen taking the place of a woman, getting carried around by a guy with the height difference they deserve. I remember one time he tried to grab me, and I got super angry and pushed him. I yelled at him too, and basically told him how I've already explained that I don't like it when he does that, and that it makes me feel insecure. He looked like some kind of sad puppy when I told him that. I almost felt bad. He did it a few more times in the future, but after a while, I managed to basically train him to never do it again. For a while, I was glad about it. But little did I know, less than a year later, I would start to wish that he would do it again. As I explained in my origin story playlist, which I'll link in the description, my inferiority complex came to a boiling point when I was 19. I almost checked out of life that day, but my brain had different plans. Something snapped, and suddenly I embraced my natural place at the bottom of the hierarchy. In an instant, I went from liking petite, voluptuous, feminine women to the complete opposite. Tall, muscular women with broad shoulders that had once made me feel worthless and gave me nightmares. And this hetero-flexible orientation did mean that I suddenly started enjoying thinking of myself as being the victim of the same kind of violations that just minutes before would have been my own personal hell. Going to prison and being someone's prison girlfriend was once the most terrifying thing I could possibly imagine, but after that, suddenly it didn't sound so bad anymore. As long as the guy wasn't fat. And this completely changed the dynamic I had with that friend. It was a pleasant surprise to him, at least, as it was to me, since I was now much more positive and confident and didn't have so many rules for him to follow all the time to make sure I don't get triggered. But like I said, I had basically trained him to not trigger me, and I had to train him again to trigger me. So he told me that he didn't feel comfortable being mean to me, even though I told him that I liked it. So I kind of eased him into it. Before I snapped, one of my biggest insecurities was my small feet. I remember in the past, if the topic of his US size 13 men's feet ever came up in conversation, it used to make me want to leave the area and chug down 8 gulps of gin to block it out. But now, as we were playing video games with our shoes off, I remember sitting next to him, comparing my tiny size 7 foot with his, and enjoying hearing him tease me for it. It's amazing how quickly I pivoted from rage to submission. So one cold night when we were both drunk, sitting outside on a bench smoking a cigarette together between games, I decided to test him a little bit. I snuggled up real close and leaned my head against his shoulder. To my surprise, he didn't seem to mind at all, actually, and this only foreshadowed what was to come. But a couple years back, the tension between my friend and I would come to a head. I remember we were both leaning against his car in the dark, drinking some beers together. We were having a heartfelt conversation, and the alcohol was making him all sentimental. All of a sudden, I remember feeling this warmth and looming presence behind me, head and shoulders above me. Without asking permission, he slowly enveloped me. I felt his large, powerful hands cup around each of my shoulders. It made me feel weak and vulnerable, how tiny my shoulders were in his grip. His fingers could literally touch tips across my chest, and his thumbs could touch across my back. My neck was completely at his mercy. If he would have tried this when I was 18, I would have immediately recoiled and chastised him for it before trying to drink my insecurities away. But I had learned to adapt to my circumstances. By the time of this story, it had been nearly a decade since my last workout. My muscles were weak and atrophied. My small body was powerless. Meanwhile, he had been regularly working out that whole time to the point where he was lifting nearly twice what I could at my peak. Out in that dark driveway in that rural area, I knew there were no witnesses. No one could help me even if I wanted them to. I was completely helpless. His large hands held down my little arms. He could have done literally anything he wanted with me, and there wasn't a damn thing that I could have done to stop him. So instead of trying to fight it in vain, I completely surrendered and gave in. His big manly hands that once made me feel inferior by comparison began to rub my girly little shoulders, and all my tension melted away into feelings of euphoric bliss as I leaned back against him, my head resting on his chest. Even in such a vulnerable situation, I felt safe, warm, and protected. It went on like that for at least 15 minutes. And the whole time, I was just fantasizing about how this is what it would feel like if a tall, powerful woman decided to give me a shoulder massage. And I reveled in it. It's kind of funny to think that if 99% of women saw me in that position, they would actually be jealous and wish they could take my place. Because regardless of how vulnerable they would be next to a towering man who didn't ask permission, standing in the dark with no one around, the majority of women would have enjoyed it for the same reason I did. They're submissive. They get off on the danger of being vulnerable to a man that has the power to completely crush them if he wanted. They don't want to be the tall, dominant big spoon giving the massage. They want to be the small, submissive little spoon receiving it. And it's for this reason why I have such an intimate understanding of why most women like what they like. And I don't blame them for it. I'm immersed in that state of being. It's kind of sad when you think about it. I truly cherish that memory because it's the closest I've ever come to experiencing being enveloped by a tall woman. But instead, I had to resort to giving in to the advances of my male friend out of desperation. I wish I could find a woman who could take that role, but it's become increasingly clear that even to tall masculine women, they want to experience what I did. But he wasn't the only tall friend who turned out to like me for a little more than my personality. It's honestly strange looking back, thinking about how difficult of a person I could be sometimes, yet I managed to make and keep friends anyway. It really does make me wonder if some of these guys just put up with me because I was cute. Sure, we had a lot in common, but I was pretty sensitive and easily triggered. It makes me think about how many women complain that their guy friends might not be real friends and possibly wouldn't want to be friends with them at all if it weren't for their looks. My other tall guy friend from high school was about 2 or 3 inches shorter than the one who gave me the massage, but still well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders. I never really thought about his orientation until we got back in contact around the time of the lockdowns. In 2020 and 21, I was building an Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube channel around my catboy persona as a bizarre publicity stunt to promote my new business. I think the whole catboy thing drove him so wild that he couldn't keep it contained anymore. All of a sudden, for the first time ever, he was sending me all these creepy texts gushing over how adorable I was. His family was kind of religious growing up, and he was almost mad and wished I wouldn't do it because of how I was so cute and how it drove him insane and made him have sinful thoughts. But have I had similar encounters with women as I've had with guys like him? They have happened, yes, occasionally, sometimes, but they're much more rare. It's not very often that a female is more attracted to a cute, petite, weak, submissive little cat boy than she is to a tall, dominant alpha male. And it's crazy to think about how men like me for the same reason they like women, being small and cute. Stories like these aren't just flukes. They're only a few standout experiences out of many that keep happening up to this very day. Even just a couple days ago, I got asked out by a gay guy around my age. Of course, it's only ever men that seem to do this. So you might think, if men want me, I must be attractive, right? Then why don't women feel the same? In my mid to late teens, I knew this feeling all too well. In the first few months of 2020, I decided to try out a little experiment. I had spent years on dating apps at that point, hardly getting any dates with any of the tall women I desired. I even paid the cuck fee for Bumble Premium for several months. It barely helped at all. It was around that time when I started listening to the Eggman. I found all the studies that confirmed my deepest suspicions about height being linked to wealth, status, intelligence, strength, and health. I always knew deep down it was true, but after seeing it for myself, I needed therapy. I had become immersed in the darkest of pills, more than ever before, disillusioned, wondering if I ever would be able to find the tall woman I wanted. So I tried setting my height to 6'4" on Bumble. And lo and behold, the matches rolled in. I used the app for maybe an hour a day and got about 30 matches every time. It was overwhelming. Of course, the moment I told them my real height, they were gone. So a few months later, I tried my second experiment. I downloaded Grindr. I thought, if I can't find a tall, dominant woman, let's see how much I'm desired by men of that same phenotype. This time, I put my real height, 5'3.5", with all the same pictures. Within just a few days, all of the tallest, strongest, most masculine, dominant men on the platform were competing for my attention. It was almost scary how much attention I got. It was intimidating. I realized that with how insular the gay community is, even in the San Francisco Bay Area where it's flourishing, there's a lot of promiscuity and a high risk for disease. Knowing that, I decided to bow out. I left a lot of them disappointed, and I felt a little guilty for that. I would have made a lot of people jealous, and it could have ended quite badly. All this experiment did was reaffirm the truth that the only people who want short men are other men. They call us twinks, and I guess I would have been one of the most desirable twinks in the gay capital of the world. The only logical conclusion a short guy can come to from looking at these results is that our small, framelit bodies make us look effeminate and submissive. There's a primal evolutionary reason for this that I talk about in my comment response video, which I'll link in the description below. To someone like me, when I was 18, who isn't comfortable with their place in the hierarchy, such a conclusion could be devastating and possibly make you not even want to continue with life. But I was able to accept and embrace this knowledge after years of mental anguish. What once would bring me to the darkest abyss is now just a source of twisted, masochistic joy. Not everyone can adjust their idea of themselves so drastically. It needs to happen spontaneously, like it did for me. And I have never found a more effective cope. Because, yeah, it's hard to accept that fertile, high estrogen women almost universally find you less attractive because they subconsciously or consciously see you as feminine. And this same curse that deprives you of female intimacy and companionship also attracts unwanted attention from the large, masculine, high testosterone men that you envy. They've got the more powerful body, leaving you vulnerable to their domination, and the women know it. And when they compare you to him, it just makes them want him more. So that's what we exist for? Women's comparison fantasy? To make their chads look even hotter? And to be the toys for the few chads who like to swing the other way? That's why I just hope to God that there are enough tall women who have the same preferences as dominant gay men, or it's going to be a long and lonely road ahead for us. Based on my experience, there does seem to be a minority of bi women who actually like petite pretty boys. But of course, that also requires that you have a good face card. Short and ugly? Well, you're shit out of luck. It's interesting, though, that the only women who like short pretty boys just happen to also be attracted to women. See what I'm getting at? Coincidence? I think not. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The only other tall women I've met in real life who have liked me the same way men do are trans women, which makes sense considering they still have the same brains they did when they were men. However, like regular women, even most tall trans women see themselves as submissive and want a guy to be dominant. But hey, if you're a short guy who still likes to be the dom, then the numbers are in your favor on this one. And it gets even crazier. The vast majority of women have such a strong fixation on height that many, if not most of them, would rather date another woman than date a short man. According to the experience of the 6'2" women who left this comment, it seems like straight women would rather masculinize another woman for being tall and having broad shoulders than to give in and mate with a short guy. If the only men on Earth were her height or shorter, she'd rather turn lesbian and pretend a tall woman is a man than continue the human race with a small man who actually has the right tools for the job. How brutal is that? It's all about phenotype. In fact, apparently, your phenotype is more important than your actual gender. Your skeletal phenotype, which you have almost no control over, determines how people treat you for the rest of your life. When you have a small frame, soft face, voice, and mannerisms, people profile you as being beneath them immediately. In fact, people take one look at me and assume I'm gay before I even say anything. And this effeminate phenotype tends to attract a certain type of male attention that might actually be scary and deeply degrading to experience, depending on your personal feelings about it. Men like me are constantly labeled as twinks everywhere we go, regardless of how we feel. People classify us based on our phenotype, whether you identify as a twink or not. After years of bullying and demeaning assumptions and experiences, the chronic shame and humiliation eventually got to me, and I had to turn about 5% gay just to adapt. Instead of fighting back against the tide of reality, I embraced the idea of being a submissive bottom. But since I'm still 95% straight, I still desire a female, but just a woman with the same phenotype that most women desire in men. I now fully understand why women like the men they do. I can only hope that there are a few women out there who had a radical shift like I did. So far, this really hasn't been the case. But if there are any tall women watching this video who like short pretty boys, let me know in the comments. This degrading situation we short men are dealing with all ties into the dating market, as you well know. But there's more to this dating market than most people think. Most people only think about the vanilla dating market. You know, masculine men seeking feminine women and vice versa. But there's an entire alternative dating market, full of all the kinksters, that has a major influence on the vanilla dating market in ways that can get a little complex. It's almost like a metaphorical black market of dating, where the outcasts go. In the world of BDSM and even LGBT circles, there's a surplus of subs and a shortage of doms. The point is, female doms are especially rare. And unfortunately, most female doms still want male subs to be tall. But in the gay community, male doms actually want short bottoms. It's the only place where we're actually widely desired, so it kind of makes sense why so many short guys turn gay, even if they weren't already, or decide to change genders. The first places fat gathers on my body are my cheeks, both face and ass. And my high-pitched manlet voice and somewhat effeminate mannerisms aren't helping me beat the allegations. Many of you might call this cope, but to be honest, I do kind of identify with that twink label, but a straight one. Straight for tall, dominant women. The only way I'd say yes to a guy is if he was like 6'6" plus with broad shoulders and muscles, just to fully immerse myself in the psychology of women. Like role playing, you know? So yeah, eventually I just stopped resisting the pressure to be manly and compete with chads, so I gave in to this new identity. But not necessarily because I felt empowered. What happened was that all my previous coping mechanisms had eventually failed and something darker took over. But it also saved me from what I was going to do that night. Almost like being given a second life with the opposite personality. Like an instant quantum switch with another branching universe. One where I was my opposite. Before I snapped at age 19, if I ever thought that a tall, dominant gay guy wanted me to be his bottom, it made me extremely angry. Being looked at in such a way was just as much of a personal hell of mine as being publicly height-mogged by a tall, athletic female. To escape my reality at the time, I would fantasize about being an 8-foot, broad-shouldered god of a man who was lusted after by every female everywhere he went, and feared and envied by the men who he bullied and lorded over with intimidation and physical domination. But every time I finished my fantasy, I felt worse about myself, not fitting into that ideal. As I got older, those fantasies eventually started turning sadistic, with thoughts of tall, powerful men and women dominating a stunted, sickly, weak manlet. It made me feel so shameful. I tried my best not to picture myself as the one being dominated, but eventually I could no longer deny the reality that I was far closer to being the puny peasant than I was to being the towering elite. And I began to discover that this whole culture of dominance is actually reinforcing a primal hierarchy where the smallest men get shoved to the bottom. Years of soul-destroying humiliation eventually broke me down until my brain was forced to accept it somehow. That fantasy I had described a minute ago had infiltrated my brain until I couldn't deny reality anymore. I am inferior as a man. There's no getting around it. But am I inferior as something other than a traditional masculine male? Not necessarily. If you have a good face card, you can at least be wanted somewhere. But once you see how systemic this all is, you start to wonder. If most women want big, manly alpha males, and the reason gay men want men like me is for being the opposite of that, then that only further confirms how opposite we are to what most women want. The growth-stunting chemicals in food and products marketed to the masses and generations of worsening class disparity have bred a growing class of submissive serfs who were designed to be dominated in every way, physically and socioeconomically. The puppet masters of this world benefit greatly from this growing physical and economic disparity. It almost feels like, as short pretty boys, the reason we're such magnets for dominant gay men is because it's almost like our bodies were custom built to take it rather than give it. Almost like our phenotypes were planned, designed, and bred over generations to be, for lack of a better word, bitch built. If we think about who benefits from this physical weakening of the lower class and who has control over our food and products, it's not that hard to let your imagination run wild. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that men of a certain stature and status are meant to be at the top of the totem pole, and men like me only seem to be desired when we're at the bottom, in more ways than one. But yeah, I used to suffer from the worst case of short man syndrome that you could imagine. And the advances from this men only made me feel less masculine, as my mind wandered into all these conclusions, which turned out to be true. And if you're interested in hearing more about the misunderstood truth behind short man syndrome, this video delves into that concept in ways you've probably never heard before. A new perspective, you might say. And if you want to hear more brutal stories and brutal truths, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be alerted of all future uploads. Thanks for watching.